Good morning, everyone. My name is Rania. I'm an architect and geographer by training. Thank you very much, Dominic, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. So my work engages technological systems, as mentioned, such as those of energy, trash, and farming, as objects of inquiry into our ideas and practices of the urban environment, and seeks through that to open up a range of aesthetic and political concerns for design research. And that I do as a scholar as well as an educator and a designer as part of the collaborative practice Design Earth. So some of these questions were part of a conversation at our annual Architecture Association meeting, where I organized a panel on architecture's environmental engagement titled Resource Territory. And the panel asked where designers stood vis-a-vis questions of the environmental imagination more broadly. For forces and materials of the earth, or what we refer to as natural resources, mediate multiple forms of economy and politics, as well as life, generally, settlement, and imagination. So what is the agency of design in shaping ecological system beyond positivist calculations and ecological iconography? And whether such imaginations of the earth beyond the mere terra economicus, the paradigm of the economic, can reclaim the production of nature and space into the domain of both disciplinary and public controversies. So the image that I like to draw on is one from 2008 by the oil and gas company Total, which conducted a corporate advertising campaign to articulate its position on the future of energy vis-à-vis the rising specter of climate change. Their motto, Communauté d'intérêt, or common interests, proposed to reconcile the objectives of economic growth, i.e. more energy demand, with the environmentalist pressures to reduce carbon emissions. And that in the consensual image of the common, as the title of the campaign points to, but also as I would like to see it through their images that they've adopted. And what you see here is one of the longer series. Visually, the campaign built on a split-screen strategy with two perfectly mirrored halves. This frame, for example, features a polar perspection landforms that reflects into an all-iconic lights Manhattan skyline. It first divides nature and the city into two distinct and essentialized domains to later reunite them in an image of perfect and rigid symmetry. So it kind of closes off the imaginary. Indeed, the mandate for clean urbanism, one can argue, has rested on the city's capacity to divest itself of the environmental cost of rapidly expanding consumer cultures, relegating responsibility for the inevitable waste products to political and geographic entities beyond city jurisdictions, or what the geographer David Harvey has referred to as an externality field. In his 1950 book, The Social Costs of Private Enterprise, the economist William Capp abstracted a general law for capitalism, one which I'm tempted to read and replace with urbanism occasionally. Capitalism, he says, must be regarded as an economy of unpaid costs, unpaid insofar as a substantial portion of the actual costs of production remains unaccounted for in entrepreneurial outlays. Instead, they are shifted to and ultimately borne by third persons or by community as a whole, maybe the common interest in this case. However, such consensual image, the image of the common interest, carries a few abstractions, at least a couple, that erase differences and homogenize space. The first abstraction is political, as the title of the campaign suggests. Common interest homogenizes divergent interest on energy behind the consensual and pacifying label of community. The second act is aesthetic, the division line itself, which by constructing two distinct spheres, production on one end and consumption on the other, eclipses a much broader technological system of the urban, which includes a large infrastructural system that ensures the life of a city. So behind the consensual image, such design abstraction of the common interest conceals the different interests of how to organize the world and distribute its resources. So why does it matter whether geographies are imagined, represented, or not? In this piece, where are the missing spaces? Following on that tours, where are the it's been a while since I've read that. The missing masses, exactly, which is a beautiful title as well because of the materiality that has for this panel. So where are the missing spaces? In this piece, I argue that when geography is made not to matter, the urban is confined to the morphological or administrative boundaries of the city, in a representation and lineage that urban studies have adopted to as a lineage of Manhattanisms. And that such confinement of the urban process to the city does a few things. It abstracts the materialities of the urban system, So the dimensions, attributes, routes, it leaves out the associated geographic transformation of such environmental technologies. So what happens the moment it's in someone else's land? And it doesn't attend to the politics of either building consensus or dissensus on how to organize the world and distribute its resources. So when geography is reduced to that thin line, the city is detached from the technological, geographic, and political attributes of the urban process. So the question is, if urbanism has served to abstract the social and spatial relations of the urban infrastructures, could the geographic as a paradigm allow to expand the scale of the urban to account for the earth and decentralize the social consensus over some global common interests? And there are many. Within energy, the words that get attached to it are needs, crisis, security, some solid social categories, which build a certain position on energy without necessarily grounding it in specific geographies of the world. So the argument is, could the groundedness of a geographic, of an energy inquiry allow us to open up some of these conversations, which sometimes construct a very solid frame of operation? Can we, by representing dimensions, forms, relationships, actors, bring into conversation, to accumulature again, public controversies by shifting things from matters of fact, from a regime of objectivity and the construction of graphs and diagrams, into matters of concern? And that's where I'd like to present the case study of the Trans-Arabian Pipeline, the Tapline. It's work that I've engaged in my doctorate research, and which spatializes the deployment of energy systems through the specific crude oil line, maps some of the physical, social, and representation territories of oil in particular, and analyzes the social and spatial transformations in the landscapes and livelihoods that occurred as the region was incorporated into a global system of energy. So I'll share some of my research on the theme very briefly, almost a few vignettes, to then open up the discussion on the geographic as a lens to address the scale of design agency in relation to energy infrastructure. The research in particular departed from a fascination with cross-border infrastructures, be they highway or, in this case, the oil pipeline, but particularly a fascination in this image in company publication of a single floating steel pipe in the landscape, what seemed to be hovering above the landscape to vanish into the horizon. A recurrent image that was popping up again and again, and that had a high capture on my imaginary at least, but I found it a bit unsettling after a while. To ground the context, such large-scale foreign concessions geographically expanded the industry, as many have beautifully argued, rendering central the role of transport infrastructure in the establishment of global oil markets. As crude is not worth much at the wellhead, it needs to get to market in an efficient fashion for capital to realize its surplus value. Geography then comes to matter greatly, or more accurately, the overcoming of its distances. So such required the development of specialized technologies of transport for happening at a larger volume over longer distances in multiple forms of technologies, be they tankers or pipeline. And the challenge of the oil industry was to deliver fossil fuels in ever-increasing quantities, all while ensuring that abundance at that moment does not drive price down. So to eliminate competition and stabilize prices, major world oil companies deployed the spatial and legal infrastructure which strove for monopolies on supply by instituting exclusive control over transport channels, at least in the case of this pipeline. So, although modern urbanization has been heavily dependent on fossil fuels, the infrastructure of oil remains unaccounted for in some of our landscape and urban framework. Its extraction in the distant and the underground, coupled with an urban analysis at the cityscape, has contributed to keeping the infrastructure of energy out of sight and of severing the continuity in the energy system between crude geographies and the refined world. And there's a few representational constructs which have been part of the reproduction of this role. One can think of a few, but we can extend it also to more, which was starting to become more prominent after the object was decommissioned. But the three that I think of immediately are the techno-utopian construct, in which the consensual image of a developmental artifact leaves out some of the broader negotiations which were part of the conversation. So the motto of Operation Tapline, the pamphlet that you see, is almost energy does great things. Just let's leave it there for a technological conversation. The second order is is a geopolitical reading of this project. And as helpful as that is for emphasizing the multiple actors involved in the process, the geopolitical order often leaves out the materiality of the conduit itself in favor of usually a broad line on a regional map at the early stages of negotiation, only to reappear in subsequent moments of crisis. But almost the daily life of that infrastructure is less part of that concern. And also some of the more contemporary conversations on the rise of the space of flows, which smooths over the conduit of circulation, almost enacting the fantasies of capital to the absolute, leaving much interest of the actually multiple friction necessary for the process of making things flow. So by framing infrastructure geographically, space becomes an active process rather than a predefined container, which is constantly transformed via the relations of material infrastructures, representation regimes such as maps and area photographs, and the frictions among the different actors involved. So throughout the long 20th century, the growth of oil into a global commodity has brought the Middle East and its oil infrastructure on the agendas of foreign policy and international trade, marking the space of the region from extraction fields to transportation routes and into refinery ports. Operating between 1950 and 1975, this 1,000-mile cross-border Tapline, a subsidiary of 4 American oil companies, carried part of its sister company's crude from the Aramco wells in Saudi Arabia across Jordan and Syria to a Lebanese port on the Mediterranean. The idea of the pipeline was launched in 1943 as a wartime government project to secure the newly established American concession in Saudi Arabia, and implemented a post-war private, and was subsequently implemented as a post-war private infrastructure. Tapline was then promised to contribute to the significant expansion of Arabian production, shorten the distance between Aramco's fields and the European markets, and reduce the need for tankers in the post-war period of anticipated steel shortage. So 4 maps illustrate the territories then at stake in Tapline's operation. The first one, the green one that you see, the Middle East oil facilities, with this homogeneous, continuous background, is one in which state boundaries seem to recede in favor of what appears as the broad pipelines. It highlights this desire for a continuous zone of operation in which oil flows in spite of boundaries. However, if you look at the just adjacent map, as the second one suggests, Aramco concession area, the continuity of the operation did not imply that Tapline would annihilate political borders. It illustrates that the kingdom's boundaries, particularly the northern one in this case, corresponded with that of the Aramco concession. And in a structure of a vertically integrated industry in which the production and transport of oil operated as sister company, the flow of the oil in the pipeline primarily depended on the perpetuation of the Aramco concession and the reinforcement of Saudi territoriality. So for the Saudi kingdom, the northern boundary represented a double security challenge, both guarding it against possible external threats from Iraq and Jordan, or was at least constructed as such in American security reports, but also internally over the border Bedouin tribes. So for both the concessionary company and the sovereign state, land, or more precisely its underground resources, was the new source of value and required an enduring order on the surface that secures such subsurface interest. So Tapline found itself implicated in a project of rule that sought to define Saudi territoriality and contain within the boundaries of the kingdom tribes that had moved previously into Iraq in search of water. So although it was represented as a shortcut in steel, in right drawings and not really beautifully, Tapline inscribed not without fiction the new territory in which the nation state and across the region, also at the regional stage, through which international oil companies, the transit and petro-states, as well as multiple factions involved, negotiated political rationalities. It started with extensive mapping and demarcation of the concession, not very differently from multiple other large concession areas, which were first extensively brought into visualization at the archives through the establishment of concessions. In the case of Arabia in particular, as the earlier border of conventions had defined boundaries in the region in relation to the different tribes' access to water, Tapline immediately found itself also in the survey of the multiple populations and the water resources available in there. So an immediate anthropological project of the sort. And along with marking it on maps, Tapline also operated as a territorial technology to define, settle, and secure the northern boundary. And a narrative which is familiar for company towns, but also true for larger transport infrastructures to the case. So the convention, initially with the kingdom, exempted the company from income tax or royalties during the first 15 years. The company in return undertook to pay for all, and I quote, reasonable and necessary expenses that were incurred by the government for protection, administration, customs, health, and municipal works, and it obligated itself to establish schools and hospitals in the area of pipeline station. The company paid thus a security fee and extended the provision of services and water in the newly established administrative northern frontiers province, originally referred to as the Tapline government. So 42 groundwater wells, a series of medical services, clinics, planning of adjacent towns, housing facilities, as well as schools were all part of the plan. Okay, so this territory that was brought through was multiply negotiated. One instance of which are these water troughs that were built up by the Tapline. Because of how significant water was in the tribe's livelihood, it highlighted the redefinition of the geographies of water once that political order in the region was being withdrawn. So once access to water was more on the level of the locality rather than on migration across the border. Local emirs were entrusted the task of scheduling and regulating access, so there was a structure in the political system also that was changing, and different tribes no longer defined to their own territorial boundaries, which were illy defined, negotiated sometimes violently access to water. The narrative extends into stories of building the Tapline Road, in which the continuity of the pipeline operation depended on the ways in which the company was also able to negotiate the claims of its own sister company, Aramco. So Big Oil is also has its own family feuds. The sisterhood of legal status obliged Tapline to meet developmental requests by the kingdom, all while it was trying itself to cut down its obligations towards the Saudi government, and that to safeguard Aramco's larger interests and minimize the infrastructural expenditures of the latter. So should Tapline not have taken on this project, Aramco would have had to take on 11 similar projects in the kingdom. So it was one way of setting the larger project by almost one demonstration outlet. An important one, but not as significant as what we have in the case. I'm really sorry about the quality of these images as they're appearing. You're seeing a drawing of almost an episode of these negotiations. In this case, at the node of densification of regional post-war alliances in the terminal city port, where the socialist leader in that city, very close to the fishermen, as well as to Nasser's Egypt, was part of the labor mobilization against the Tapline operation in the terminal city port. And in this case, to soften the public image of the corporation following the current oil spills along the Lebanese coast, and in relation to these multiple labor claims, in what they called in a gesture of goodwill toward the silent community, Tapline extended 2 fishermen's storage buildings somewhere here in the program, but you see it much better here. This philanthropic undertaking, as was presented, was at the cost of around about $10,000, a bit more significant than what that is now, but still quite pale in comparison with the company's profit, and yet it was worth the season's greetings cover on the company's yearly publication, these 2 yellow buildings in the background. So the nationalization of the Aramco concession, as well as other economic and political changes in the region, not least a few regional dynamics that happened around the mid-70s, eventually led that Tapline abandoned that geography, and the flow of oil was redirected into an east-west Saudi Arabian pipeline, ironically also called the Trans-Arabian Pipeline, as within Saudi Arabia at this moment. Beyond the specificity of the case study, however, the research explores how we can start to look as an energy thing-specific methodology to investigate the relations of energy infrastructure and space, and that measures a broader theoretical framework across many relevant fields that can start to bring about this conversation. And this is the context and the set of concerns which were relevant around this course, the Energy and Spatial Project course that I started first offering in 2011, and I've been yearly developing since. It's an ongoing project, quite an engaging one, I feel. And it asserts the centrality of potentially a spatial lens to look at discussions of energy, one in which every student conducts a semester-long projects to interrogate some either historical or contemporary energy thing using a series of representational tools beyond some of the more familiar ones as mapping. So we explore formats as well as travelogues, mythologies, but also a couple of ones that will look more familiar. In this case, looking at the relations of ecology and trash in Singapore, and the coupling of energy to further real estate in a smaller island, or the traveling of questions of, through looking at the mushroom, at questions of environmental pollution beyond what is defined as a circular zone of exception. So within that, we can also see the relevance on broader transformations that are not only specific to the age of fuel, but that become quite relevant as we're thinking of whatever we call them, green, renewables, alternative. This is an image in which wind is now doing great things. But what I pulled out is something which would be otherwise super hard to read, which is green is the new crimson. But it thinks of also the continuity of some of these power structures across changes of the specific mode of technology in which it insists. And the myth is rather familiar. It's great until it's on the ground, and then its drawbacks become apparent at the moment of failure. But then the utopian promises are carried and projected onto a new mode. A thing that Lewis Mumford had warned us as early as 1934. So the quest is that while all energy futures make assumptions about technology, space, and politics, visions of green landscapes tend to emphasize a renewable, non-renewable binary, which associates spatial cost exclusively with the infrastructure of oil and overlooks the social ecological imperatives of all forms of energy, at even cost discarding the current energy infrastructure, which remains significantly in place. So I'll wrap up here, but I'll say some of these was part of the conversation in New Geographies that look to historicize and materialize the relations of energy and space by bringing in particularly oil as a lens of examination, and by making visible this infrastructure. It's an invitation to articulate design's environmental agency and its appropriate scales of intervention. So it historicizes the concept back to the 1850s through what I feel is a prominent piece by Ivan Illich on the social construction of energy, in which he establishes that shift from thermodynamics to economics, but also starts to explore ways to spatialize the concept, critiques some of these discourses that were then part of a rise of concern in ecological urbanism in our field, and then calls to avoid that clean or green urbanism continues to purge matters of geography, and to say that to call for an examination on the geographies upon which our current regime rests, but also onto the proposed geographies, whatever they be, because the debate over the next mode of energy could possibly foresee and avoid the potential perpetuation of uneven geographies of power in the multiple sunbelt fields and corridors of the world. So I'll leave here, but I'll say some of these questions we've been looking at also through kind of a more disciplinary lens, and this is where I mean, it's usually easier in a context to pick what projects to play, but giving beautifully the larger set of disciplines present in that, and the afternoon panel on the visual, I was tempted to include that, but to say how architecture can speak back to that form of the territory, and what are some of its predispositions. In this case, it was part of looking at Rio's offshore project, and we got tempted over the summer to say, could we start to move beyond the abstraction? The project is called a geographic storm around the horizon, to counter an abstraction of the sea as a logistical zone, and to expand the spatial and cognitive imagery of the city to its ocean hinterland. So it calls to reclaim for a political consciousness of the ocean by projecting a constellation of urban projects between Rio's coast and the offshore, literally by drawing on a geographic aesthetic. So in this case, the horizon set at 4.7 for a person standing on the surface of the earth. And it has a longer history in architecture and urban thinking. Kevin Lynch thinks of it as the image of the city. In this case, it calls for the image of the territory to render legible the offshore territorial projects. So in this case, we extract some of Rio's 10 most iconic sites and project them into a linear archipelago, so that you can eventually reach the distance between the coast and the furthest oil platform visually and travel between them. So it's a way of occupying your imaginary when the San Patron, the Corcovado, the Sugarloaf, and the Rio Aqueduct all lead you to the last oil platform. And it also, I mean, these projects build a series of what we call geo-stories or postcard fictions, in which we recuperate some of the conversations broadly around nature into attributes which are not strictly defined as economic. In this one, we think of a moment in which the neon pink sun slips below the horizon, where everyone stops, stands, and claps in a nightly salute to the city, sea, and sky, and in which the celebration of, for these Aristotelians, the celebration of philosophy begins in wonder, and that to wonder beyond the horizon, the urge to know beyond what is conceivable, is itself the engine of civic and polis life. Thank you.